No surprise winner from F1's return to China, but still an intriguing race that taught us some very important lessons about F1 2024. We've got Scott here to help unpick all of that, and we've got to start, Scott, with the race's major flashpoint. Daniel Ricciardo absolutely furious with Lance Stroll, uncharacteristically angry, in fact. Apart from having his race ruined, what's got the Honey Badger so riled up?
Yeah, he needed no prodding really to unleash exactly what he thought of Stroll. Not just the incident itself; it's the way Stroll reacted to it. We heard on the broadcast, and it came up with a graphic on screen that Stroll said, "This idiot just braked." Jumped on the brakes in front of me, or words to that effect. And Ricardo took massive exception to that. I've listened to that Stroll radio message a dozen times, not just on the broadcast, but just in isolation on his onboard. And I would say that you can't rule out him saying these idiots rather than Ricardo specifically this idiot. But Ricardo had clearly been told that Stroll had called him an idiot. And even if Stroll was saying that about all of them, Ricardo is still in that group. So I don't think we can let Stroll off the hook too much for that remark. And Ricardo said this made his blood boil because in his view, it's clear as day, Stroll's not paying attention and has rear-ended him completely carelessly. So it's an absolutely avoidable incident. And Stroll's refusing to take any responsibility for it. And that, as much as anything else, is what really, really incensed Ricardo.
And Aston seemed to have doubled down on this afterwards as well. So even if Stroll was making those remarks in the heat of the moment to try and protect himself, he's not exactly held his hands up afterwards. Aston indicating the stewards maybe should have waited before penalising him, blaming the concertina effect, so those other cars you mentioned checking the field up and basically saying there was nothing Stroll could do. Do you buy that explanation? To me, it seemed like a case of, when you're behind the safety car, you've got to pay attention to the concertina effect. He could have maybe dived to the inside if he thought he was going to rear end somebody, but he just kind of careers into the RB and lifts it up. Is it a case of him just not paying attention?
Yeah, so there was initially when we first saw it, I had a bit of sympathy for Stroll, and I thought he just had it. When you have that concertina effect, it always gets worse when you're further back in the
Yeah,
train of cars. So
yeah.
I did wonder if that's what had happened, but I reviewed it extensively afterwards. I looked at his onboard, but I looked at the onboard of every single car in that train, going to Alonso, then George Russell, then Oscar Piastri, then Ricardo, and then Stroll himself. And it's really clear everyone else manages to slow down. They're paying attention to what the car's doing. Stroll hits Ricardo so hard, and you can see his helmet does look to the right as he's approaching Ricardo. So I think
So he
Ricardo's
wasn't
spot
looking
on.
then.
I think Ricardo's spot on, and all Stroll's doing is looking at the apex. He's looking through the corner. He's expecting that corner to go even behind the safety car as they're about, or not behind the safety car, but as they're about to restart after the safety car. He's expecting that to go as quote unquote normal, but it doesn't. So
Right.
Stroll's right in that without that concertina, without the backing up the actions of the car in front, there won't be an accident. He is right, but he's relying on it going as normal rather than being prepared to react. And from what Ricardo was saying, I completely agree. And the steward's verdict as well, they make it really clear that Stroll effectively wasn't paying attention. If he'd been prepared to slow down, if he'd anticipated something happening the way he should have done, that incident was avoidable.
Well, it won't have helped Ricardo's mood that post-race he's been penalised for overtaking Nico Hulkenberg under the safety car. Obviously, Stroll was penalised for his incident under the safety car. Aston don't agree with that. What lessons can he learn from that, though? Do you think Stroll will quietly, at least, reflect on this and change his approach for the future? Certainly, that's what Ricardo's pushing for. Or do you think Aston, with this whole sense that the stewards are against them, obviously Alonso's had 2 penalties in the past few races as well, it's a case of us versus the world?
Yeah, I'm not really sure there's going to be much of a lesson here. Ricardo's point is that Stroll needs to go away and learn from this because everyone's made that mistake, and it's just about making sure it doesn't happen again. I don't get the impression from what Stroll's saying and what Aston have said that they actually think he did anything wrong, which I think is quite concerning, and it perhaps shows a bit of a limitation on Stroll's side, an inability to sort of reflect and be able to say, yeah, okay, hold my hands up. I was wrong there. I think Ricardo's got his own lesson to learn from here. As you mentioned, his own safety car infringement. He overtook Nico Hulkenberg. I think he was repassing Hulkenberg because he thought that Hulkenberg had wrongly overtaken him behind the
Right.
safety car previously. So now the irony is that Ricciardo now gets a 3-place grid penalty for the next race because obviously he'd retired from the Grand Prix, so they can't penalise him after the fact. Stroll got his 10-second penalty in the race while he was still active. Kind of no meaningful consequence for Stroll, and a Ricciardo, for a separate incident, is the one that actually ends the race with the bigger punishment.
Well, moving on to further up the grid, obviously no surprise winner from this race, Max Verstappen won at a canter, but a surprise in terms of who finished second. Lando Norris, a great performance. McLaren suddenly on form, more like the end of 2023 McLaren that we got used to seeing and we haven't really seen so far in 2024. So where did that come from, Scott?
Well, I'd love to give a really specific answer, but then I'd know more than McLaren does, because McLaren and Lando Norris don't really understand why they were so competitive this weekend. There are a couple of theories. So McLaren has been sort of second or third fastest over a lap so far in 2024, depending on the circuit, of course. Sometimes it's been a bit worse than that, but the pace has been there over one lap. But they haven't had the race pace of the Ferrari. I feel like they've just done a better job of executing on Saturday. So that is, I think, the third fastest car in Formula One. So this wasn't, miles better than we've seen before, but the race pace was really strong. That was the surprising factor. They didn't seem to be chewing through the tyre at the rate of other races while running at the pace needed to be in front of, say, the Ferraris, or in this case for Norris, Sergio Perez in the other Red Bull. And yeah, a couple of theories about that. Wouldn't want to say this is definitively the reason why, but I think one of them is the fact that unexpectedly this weekend, the track, which is normally front limited, was more rear limited. Everybody was struggling with overloading the rear axle. Tyre temps were through the roof at times for different cars through that Grand Prix. And I wonder if that helped McLaren in a way, because there wasn't that front end limitation, and we know that they really struggle at slow speed in particular. So maybe just the rotation was coming a little bit better than they thought, and others were limited more in a way that they didn't expect. So that could be one thing. Another element is that the track's been weirdly kind of not resurfaced, but had some treatment done to it. That early in the weekend, we were hearing reports of grip changing corner to corner, but also through the corner as well. So it could have been that actually the reality didn't match up with McLaren's expectations for how that car balance would be through the corner. So all of that adding up, maybe McLaren just got more out of their car than expected, and others were held back more than they expected as well. And the upshot is, via a great drive from Norris and some opportunistic work, a surprise second place and a splitting of the Red Bulls pretty much on merit.
Yeah, really impressive performance, and obviously caught even them by surprise. Does that thing you mentioned about the limitation in terms of the tyre moving from front to rear axle explain also why Ferrari weren't quite at the races so far? We've got used to them effectively being second best and Red Bull's nearest challengers. So if Sergio Perez is not going to finish second behind Verstappen, you'd have expected Charles Leclerc or Carlos Sainz to be in that place, but they weren't quite there. What was going on with Ferrari?
Yeah, it could be the same problem, because I feel like mid-weekend, so we had the new sprint format for this weekend, the first sprint of 24, which meant that with the different ordering of the session, sprint quali Friday afternoon and the sprint race Saturday morning, and then qualifying for the main race on Saturday afternoon, we had a new situation where Parc Ferme reopened for qualifying for the main race. And the suggestion was that Ferrari made some setup changes off the back of what they'd learned in the sprint to try and protect the tyres a bit more because of that change to it being rear limited. That seemed to take a bit of potency out of the car over one lap in qualifying, so they were weaker over one lap than they expected to be, started further back than they probably should have done. And then the pace after that was kind of okay. And the way that Leclerc's stint went, I feel like if he'd had track position over Norris, that race could have played out differently. Now,
so they were quite evenly matched then in that case.
Once
they were running at their pace.
I think so, but I mean, after the safety car and that run to the end, it was clear that Norris had a pace that Leclerc couldn't match. So it might well have been that Norris would have had just about the edge and maybe could have done something about it, roles reverse, but the pace offset might not have been so much that he could have overtaken Leclerc on track. We will never know. The only thing I would say is that Leclerc did seem to be able to go with Norris in what looked like eking out a very interesting one-stop, which we didn't get to see play out because of the way those safety cars interrupted the race and gave the two stoppers a free stop. It kind of shook out a little differently. I don't think Ferrari were as weak or problematic as it maybe looked on paper. It was just a bunch of circumstances meant that they sacrificed track position, and unlike in Japan, for example, they weren't able to regain that on Sunday. The McLaren was just surprisingly too quick.
Hilarious irony that if the rules designed to allow teams more freedom to mess with their setups have actually helped Ferrari in the end make their race worse. It sounds like they would have been better off just leaving the car alone. So maybe sometimes you can have too much of a good thing.
Well, the same could be said of Mercedes.
Yes, Mercedes. Well, let's talk about Mercedes because, I mean, they were just not at it again, were they? An encouraging sprint race for Lewis Hamilton, obviously thanks to qualifying in the wet and qualifying out of position. But in the Grand Prix itself, I mean, they're struggling to be even fourth best team, never mind in that conversation for best of the rest.
Yeah, I actually think on balance this weekend, it was about what you have to expect from Mercedes in 2024. Between the two cars, they probably did about as much as you would think they would do. Obviously, Hamilton massively overachieved in sprint qualifying, took a great advantage of the wet, showed them for anyone who sort of doubts whether or not he's one got the ability or two's got the interest. When the chance was there, he did take it in the wet in qualifying, and then I think in the sprint race as well did a really good job. But we know that when that car has track position, especially over a sprint race, so it's a shorter stint, it can actually run competitively in that group of cars with Ferrari, McLaren and Aston Martin. So actually Hamilton was just at the very upper end of what that car can achieve on Saturday. Then on Sunday, qualifying and Sunday, Russell was the one who got the most out of the car, but the most out of that car is sniping to beat an Aston, one of the Ferraris, one of the McLarens if they underachieve. I do think the Mercedes is fourth best, and when Hamilton sometimes this season's been guilty of chasing a bit of a golden bullet on setup, I don't think it's the same as recent years where he has led experiments for Mercedes in terms of trying to work out where the window of the car is. I feel like this is more Hamilton-led. He apologised for getting it wrong this weekend. He then obviously set himself up for an even worse race day because the changes that they made when Parc Fermé opened made that car balance clearly worse, not just over one lap, but also over a race distance.
So is the lesson there for Mercedes and Hamilton in particular? He just needs to kind of, well, take a chill pill, I guess, and not chase something that kind of isn't there, maybe.
Yeah, I feel like the best, the most rational way of looking at there is just like don't overreach. Kind of to a point with what you have on a given weekend, accept what you have. The two lessons I would say for Mercedes are one, a reinforcement of the lesson of the first few races, which is you have to add more performance to that car. It's just not quick enough. But two, just do the best that you can with what you got at the moment, because Hamilton, when he does that, is really, really effective. We saw it in parts, most of the weekend at Suzuka. We saw it in the sprint here, but he overreached and he paid the price for that come Sunday.